Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 72 for Sunday the 19th of April, and this week's movie is The People vs. Larry Flynt, telling the story of pornographer and publisher of Hustler magazine and his numerous legal battles to protect his right to publish under the umbrella of the First Amendment, the protection of free speech, Larry Flynt and his associates. My name is Martin Darlington, and this week I'm joined as ever by Andrew Blischik. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Martin. Hope all is well with you and the family. The first thing that we've decided to acknowledge is the obvious, and that's that the whole world is undergoing the most life-changing events seen since probably the Second World War. We hope with urgent sincerity that all of you are safe, remain safe, and although it feels inevitable that someone out there hearing this will have experienced a COVID-19 related tragedy, we do hope that this isn't the case. Please stay safe, positive, and always remember that you're not alone, however much the four walls may seem to be closing in around you. We're not sure if he still listens, but we do remember that Jacob Morrison, an early correspondent and supporter, is a paramedic, and we thank him, salute him, and wish him every good fortune as he puts himself in the firing line.
Yeah, in updates, I'd just like to completely echo what Andrew says there, and in updates and errata, the next outing for HBH will be The Coal Miner's Daughter, about Loretta Lynn and her fairly incredible life. And in further news and reviews, we have for some time had an in-house medical consultant in the form of Dr. Phil Pomerantz, who's been a wonderful supporter, correspondent, listener. We now have a no-kidding straight-up consultant on US law enforcement with particular focus on the FBI. You know who you are. So when Martin Scorsese finally gets around to shooting and releasing Killers of the Flower Moon, a fascinating yet dark examination of a series of murders of Osage tribal members in the 1920s, which led to the birth of the FBI as we know it, we are sorted for a subject matter expert. So thank you, sir. We've had a review from, now I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Yodia Tyson. There is a story we hear behind the name, and we're looking forward to hearing what that is. But we get 5 stars, perfect podcast for binge listening. Well-researched, clearly presented, and language that is inclusive, clean, intelligent, and intelligible, which is appreciated. The no-fuss, no-frills approach focuses attention on what matters, the film, the history, and the gaps between the two. This enables HBH podsters to find their way through the viewing experience in an informed manner. Keep up the good work and news about the cats. Best to both of you, Yoadja Tyson. So that's...
Wow, thank you very much.
Yoadja not only left us a great review, but also sent us a very generous donation. And she has a wonderful story to tell us about how our podcast has fallen in line with some of her memories, because she did send in an email that she appreciates that we refrain from the usual bro talk swearing slang. We respect the listeners respect us. She says it's a nice tone for an international programme, but our shows have special meaning for her because her grandfather and father were involved in showing Hollywood and British movies in Australian picture theatres, not called movie theatres then, in Sydney and tiny regional towns from the 30s through to the 1960s. They used to collect the cans from the distribution houses located near Central Station in Sydney soon after they came off the boats and later the planes. They'd splice the reels and manage the projection machines that were a combination of click-clack railway spool feeders and explosive fire hazard. She really likes the reviews of the classics. She can map her family stories by showing these movies to the historical context at the time. And we also learned that Yoadja is a professor at an Australian university in allied health, rehabilitation and disability. So she's offering her help for any of those themes. Brilliant.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Yoadja. Further on listener feedback, Linda Lux wrote, "We'll miss you both, especially during this isolation. Here in St. Louis, Missouri, and during this period of uncertainty, your discussion of some of my favourite books and movies have been so enjoyable. Even picked up or watched some again or for the first time. All the best and look forward to hearing from you. Linda Lux." Well, thank you very much, Linda. Happy to entertain you. We also heard from both Phil and David Pomerantz, both of whom were very complimentary about the denial episode. and also reported on both Ford versus Ferrari, which they liked very much, and Midway, which they found less impressive, although Phil did point out that it's better than Pearl Harbor, which of course isn't saying much.
We also heard from old friend Doug Moore. Doug endorsed Brad Michaels' suggestion of Pierpoint, The Last Hangman. He also mentioned a movie called Pain and Gain, which he describes as a tasteless, tacky movie that appealed to his 28-year-old self, and he doesn't recommend it, but says it's very keen to keep pointing out throughout the movie that it's a true story. It's directed by Michael Bay, which in my mind doesn't recommend it at all. It stars Mark Wahlberg, who I found can be very good in the right movie. He's a Miami bodybuilder who recruits a gang of fellow gym bunnies to commit a kidnap for ransom. Apparently it's a terrible film, so we probably won't cover it soon. But sorry, Doug.
We've also got 2 late entry emails that came from Stuart Ragdale, who endorsed our upcoming choices of The Highwayman and Midway, and also encouraged Martin to take the plunge and watch The West Wing, which the current situation may well encourage Martin to do. The other email was from an old Motorpod buddy of Martin's, Patrick Lehman, who asked if we might consider covering the AMC series Turn, Washington's Spies, which Martin was delighted to be able to tell Patrick that we've already done in our 3rd supplementary show, episode 31, where Martin took a look at Band of Brothers, Rome, Black Sails, Peaky Blinders and Turn. You did like Turn, didn't you, though, as a TV experience?
Yeah, I really did. Yeah, it was really good, and from that I then ended up reading the book on which inspired the series, and finding out an awful lot that I did not know about the.
Excellent.
I mean, one of the shocking things was the 18th century attitude to espionage. It was ungentlemanly. Spies were dirty turncoats and traitors and, filthy thieves
Liars.
in the night sort of thing. Yeah, liars. And you're like, yeah, but it's really, really important to know what the enemy's doing. And there is an argument that the spy ring, the Culper spy ring that the movie's based around, possibly turned the course of history by warning Washington that the British were aware of a French attack. I'm not sure if many Americans are taught that really without the French they probably wouldn't have won the War of Independence, but there was a French attack that the British were aware of, and he managed to stop it. If it had gone ahead, the likely casualties of the French would have been in the area that they would have withdrawn, and well, it's one of those turning points of history that possibly the Culper ring managed to prevent. So it was amazing. But one thing it led me to realise, when we look back through the back catalogue of shows, most of the supplementary episodes simply have the main titles, such as The Ones That Got Away. And a potential listener would have to click on the blue link, so all the previous episodes are listed at the bottom of each page on the website, www.historybyhollywood.com, and you'd have to click on the blue link to actually find what the content is. And on the one that included Turn, it's not even listed. So I am going to go back and do some editing. The detail just says there's a number of movies including this, and this, but there's 11 movies or 12 movies I think we cover. So here's a quick breakdown of what is included in the supplementaries. So episode 12 saw supplementary 1, music in the movies. It's an examination of the way that music is used to inform, to guide, and at times to manipulate. Episode 21 was Supplementary 2, The Ones That Got Away Part 1. And this is the one that I was really quite shocked that I had to go back and listen to find out what we'd covered in it. So this looks at, and this is a brief overview, basically The Ones That Got Away are movies that were based around factual events, but not close enough to warrant a full episode. So Gone with the Wind, Apocalypse Now and Platoon, Titanic, U-571, Saving Private Ryan, A Perfect Storm, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Mission, JFK, Cool Runnings and United 93. Episode 31 was Supplementary 3. That was the TV special Andrew's already mentioned with Band of Brothers, Rome, Black Sails, Peaky Blinders and Turn. And then episode 59 was Supplementary 4, The Ones That Got Away Part 2, where we did Bridge on the River Kwai, Mississippi Burning, The Greatest Showman, The Lost City of Zed, Bat 21 and Gangs of New York. So I will amend the show notes for each of those so people can actually see precisely what's covered. And if I'm feeling energetic enough, I will put the time that within the show that how many minutes has gone before people before a particular piece starts, in case people want to find out about The Greatest Showman. Why would you? Just delete it from your library. Sorry, I did not like that film.
Good on you, Martin. That's a lot of work you've just given yourself, so thanks very much.
Yeah, and I'll get that done definitely by 2022. Back to this week's episode. For people who, after they've heard the show, may want to follow up on the Larry Flynt story, there is a pretty fascinating YouTube video we found during research, which is a 1977 TV debate between Larry Flynt and, 1997 TV debate, or is it 77? Can't remember. Between Larry Flynt and Reverend Jerry Falwell.
Must be 97.
Yeah, I think it's 97. Yes, sorry, it is. It's 1997. On the Larry King Show. And strangely, after the events portrayed in the movie, they kind of became friends. And this is mentioned in Larry Flynt's autobiography, which was one of our main sources for the show, An Unseemly Man. But we'll put a link to that in the show notes to that YouTube. It's an hour and 23, so they go in quite a bit of depth.
Before we get to the story of the movie, you've found a clip from Milos Forman, the director, on what motivated him to make this movie. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm sorry, I'm stealing your thunder here.
That's okay.
The story of the movie.
Amadeus.
Amadeus. He was seen as a really cerebral movie director. He was in Czechoslovakia. He was born. He was alive and conscious, old enough to be conscious of his surroundings under Nazi Germany. Then he lived under the Soviet Russia's domination, and then he moved to America. So he's a real passionate freedom guy, but as he says, he was deeply uncomfortable with Larry Flynt and what he stood for and what he did, until he realised that what he stands for is far more than just the freedom to print pornography. So yeah, we've just got a clip. This is Milos Forman explaining why he felt it was important.
Then why make a film about Larry Flynt?
Because this case he brought to the Supreme Court resulted in a very, very important decision about the freedom of expression. And I'm telling you, I know from my life experience, freedom of the press is the cornerstone of democracy. It's not elections. They can be manipulated if you don't have a free press. It's not a free market. Hitler had a free market. It's the freedom of the press. And if you open the door to the censorship a crack, it will never stay open a crack. When you let the gene of censorship out of the bottle, you'll never put him back. And it will have a devastating effect on the quality of life. Not only that life becomes very boring, but life becomes very cruel. Because under the censorship, anybody finally who didn't agree with the official ideology and the official taste and official regulations is enemy of state and will be silenced. And if you can't, if people who are doing atrocious things because they have power, if they are not afraid that tomorrow they will read about it in the newspapers or on television, you are only encouraging this cruelty.
Okay, thanks for Martin. So with that, let's get on with the show, and as always, start with the story of the movie. The People vs. Larry Flynt is a 1996 biopic. It covers some 35 years in the life of Larry Flynt, a publisher of the pornographic magazine Hustler. As we've already said, it was directed by Milos Forman, Czech-born director, and some of his successful movies we've already mentioned. I guess his two Oscar-winning movies, the most famous, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and a movie that we covered in episode 13, Amadeus. Apparently, initially Bill Murray and then Tom Hanks were considered for the lead role, but it eventually went to the affable Woody Harrelson. The movie also stars Courtney Love and Ed Norton in supporting roles, and portraying Larry Flynt's brother Jimmy is the real-life brother of Woody Harrelson, Brett Harrelson.
I've got to say, sorry, on that, it's strange, because I don't think Woody and Brett particularly look similar. Seeing them next to each other, you wouldn't think I wouldn't automatically think, oh, they're obviously related. They don't look that much the same. So I just found that strange.
Yeah, and I don't know what else Larry has done in his acting career, but he does a creditable job in this, doesn't he?
Yeah.
The script, the script was written by a screenwriting duo, Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, and they had already found success as screenwriters in movies for a while, and they've got quite a diverse portfolio, including the script for teen spy movie Agent Cody Banks, Goosebumps, and even the recent Netflix hit with Eddie Murphy, Dolomite Is My Name. Specifically, the story culminates around a Supreme Court case between Larry Flynt and right-wing televangelist Jerry Falwell, where the trial officially was titled Hustler Magazine versus Falwell. The movie's been favourably received by the critics, and it's currently got a positive score on Rotten Tomatoes of 88%. It won quite a few Art House Film Festival awards for the director, as well as Harrelson in the lead role, and both Courtney Love and Ed Norton were nominated for several supporting actor roles. Foreman and Harrelson were both nominated for Oscars in the 1997 Oscar Awards, but they were both unsuccessful. And unfortunately, financially, it seems to have been a flop, costing some $35 million to make and recouping only $20 million at the box office.
Yeah, I was unable to find worldwide figures. These are only US domestic figures. So it's possible it made a bit more, but maybe it didn't do that well internationally, although I think that the message it has is relevant for all societies, not just, although it talks about the First Amendment, most countries have most countries have a degree of freedom of speech enshrined in their constitutions or their legal practices. But yeah, it's 80% audience, so the critics like it slightly more than audiences, but they're still very respectable figures.
So shall we get on with the actual analysis, the synopsis and analysis now?
I think we should, after this very brief musical break. And that choice of music, which, as we speak, Andrew probably isn't aware what it was the dueling banjos. That is basically that's an homage to the opening scenes, which take us to the Kentucky hills in the early 50s, where two young lads are dragging a homemade wheeled cart through the woods with jugs of moonshine balanced on it. And we see them selling this jug to an old fella in a shack for $2. One of the lads is Larry Flynt, aged 10, with his brother Jimmy, aged 8. They return home and find their pa drunk on their merchandise, for which Larry gives him a telling off, throwing a jug at his head, and it's a slightly comic scene. But just to sort of wrap that up, the scenes are pretty accurate. Larry and Jimmy did sell moonshine as kids. They were Kentucky hillbillies.
Yeah, I think they were a little bit older. He might have been like 18 or something like that in real life, from what the brief research that I did on that. But they do compress a lot of his early life, or ignore a lot of his early life, don't they, in the movie?
Yeah, their parents divorced when the boys are still quite young, although their mother remarried. But yeah, I mean, Larry Flynt is quite open and proud of his background. He's like, yeah, I'm a Kentucky hillbilly, and we'll just sort of to set the scene in between the opening scene and the following one, which is the two adult brothers now in a strip bar. Skips quite a lot of Larry's life. He joined the army in 1958, but due to service cutbacks post-Korean War, he was released after less than a year's service after apparently scoring low on the tests, the entrance tests. They just weeded out the whoever did lowest on the test. He had a short period doing odd jobs, then he joined the Navy, and he did very well, completing 4 years' service between 1960 and 1964. Using money he saved from his Navy years and a couple of jobs he did when he'd left, he bought his mother's bar and eventually several more, calling them hustler bars. These were strip joints after a fashion, although Larry held strict rules for girls and punters alike. And this is sort of back to the movie now. This is where we meet Larry and Jimmy in their bar.
Yeah, that's right. And what they're doing is they're going through the books, and things aren't looking great, and for their bar business. And Larry knows why. They need to raise their profile. So guys who like to go to their seedy bars need to know that they're there. Larry goes to a printer. He wants to launch a newsletter for his Hustler Go-Go bars, but only wants to print pictures of naked ladies in these 8-page leaflets, literally. The printer tells him that that's not on. You can't just make it pictures. You need some text as well. But Larry's having none of this, but he eventually, the printer prevails, and we see Larry showing Jimmy his newly printed magazine when they both notice a new girl arriving on stage that grabs Larry's attention. This new girl dancing on stage is Althea Leisure, played by Courtney Love, and Larry is immediately suspicious that she may be underage. She's summoned to Larry's office, and he challenges Althea over her age. She tells him that she is very, very, very nearly just about old enough, which we assume is 18. Then he gives her a swig of his moonshine, which nearly chokes her. They continue to flirt, and then when Jimmy comes back to speak to Larry later, we get to hear that they're both going at it, so they've gotten on well, obviously. Althea also reveals that she's bisexual and informs Larry that he's not the only person to have bedded every woman in his club. So we've got the first publication mentioned fairly early in the movie. How did they go with that history?
Yeah, pretty good. They've set themselves up in southern Ohio. I think they're in Cincinnati at this stage. Larry starts to produce a newsletter for the bar to try and raise awareness. That's absolutely right. And the way he runs his bars, as he puts in his biography, is he broke all the rules and became rich. Because everyone was telling him, no, you don't have high overheads. But he did, because he had a lot of girls. He paid them well. They had very strict rules, and he said, I want to make it absolutely clear, I'm not running a brothel here. I'm running it's a go-go bar, I think they were called. He employed really good DJs. He only stocked 2 beers in his range, and he charged top dollar for them, because he'd started off with blue-collar bars, but he said the problem is the guys get drunk and they fight. And if the police get called, that's how they worked out. If yours was a troublesome bar, you had your liquor license pulled. So he decided to go up market. So he's going for travelling businessmen and lonely locals looking for an escape from their daily grind. Althea does need some introduction. She was 17 and a half when Larry met her, although he'd have usually told someone underage to get lost and just fired her on the spot. Something about her fascinated him. He quickly appointed her to oversee the girls at the club where she tried to become a dancer, and very soon to oversee all the girls in that county in the different bars. Not long after this, so still I think in her late teens, Althea said she was ready to manage run a club as manager. So Larry took her at her word and said okay, and he appointed her to his worst earning bar. Within weeks she turned it around. We'll get into more of Althea's story later, although the quote about Larry not being the only person to have slept with all the girls in the bar is said to be true.
Oh, great stuff. So back in the movie, we see Larry in a cafe with Jimmy admitting that Althea is moving in with him, when a trucker asks them if they're the owners of this Hustler Club magazine, and he asks if they are, how can he subscribe? Larry says it's just a newsletter and doesn't have a subscription option. Then later at his house with a group of his team, Larry is examining a Playboy magazine and he mocks its articles. He's clearly seen the need for a more honest and direct approach to America's male readership. Then we see Larry and Jimmy are at a photo shoot where the photographer is telling the nude model to open her legs a little bit more and be more provocative. And we've got a clip of Larry defending this approach.
Okay, now let's go for that leg thing here. Let's recline a little. Yeah, I see you open up them legs a little bit. That's right. Now give me a little wider on that. That's it. Now give me a little wider. Just another little touch wider. No, maybe not quite that wide.
Wait. No, that. Get back to that. That's exactly what we want. Here. Okay, that's perfect. Leave it right there. That's what you want. Now, a woman's vagina has as much personality as her face.
But you can't show the genitalia.
Why not?
Well, Larry, Rudy's right. You can't show, legally, you can't show the vagina.
Shut up, Jimmy. Rudy, Are you a religious man?
Yeah.
Okay, you believe God created man?
Yeah.
God created woman.
Yeah.
Well, then surely the same God created her vagina. And who are you to defy God? Just shoot her.
So the subscription story is, according to Larry, very true. That's what gave him the idea for Hustler to be a full-blown, nationally distributed magazine. And it wasn't just one incident. He said he was repeatedly approached by guys going, can I subscribe just to the magazine? I can't always get to the bars, but yeah, I'd be interested in the magazine. He still considers Playboy and Penthouse to be hypocritical publications, ashamed of their real selling point. And he said, are you going to buy Penthouse or Playboy to decide which stereo to buy? No, you're going to buy Stereo Magazine, or Stereo Monthly or something. He made sure that Hustler would be different. It would cater to blue-collar tastes in the girls, their depictions, which are very revealing, as we'll see, and especially the humour. One of the concerns of the guys and girls he brought in who had magazine backgrounds or publishing backgrounds saying, look, you can't say this about that certain group. And he said, no, we can, provided we offend every group. So they offended all races, all religions, all nationalities, all socio-economic backgrounds. They had a policy of I guess they probably kept score of, right, we need to do one about this group because we've offended the others, so to make sure people know it's balanced. But the photo shoot scene depicts Larry's approach accurately. However, that was always a strategy. I don't think it was just a one-off thing of, oh, no, let's have our legs open. He was specifically, his marketing strategy was to display female genitalia because that's what he said guys like. And you can't argue with that, looking at his success from a purely commercial point of view.
Yeah, exactly. So back in the movie, we're at the office of what has now become Hustler. Reveals that with their new revealing pictures, they've only had a 25% sell-through. The bottom line means that they've got 150,000 copies left unsold. Larry and Althea argue over what they're going to do because they've only got enough to see them publish one more issue before they're wiped out. Althea is in mid-rant when the phone rings and Larry speaks to a man claiming that he has naked pictures of former First Lady Jackie Onassis. We've got a clip of this conversation.
Mr. Flynn, we have a guy on the phone from Italy. He claims he has naked pictures of Jackie O.
Put him through. Yeah, hello. You're the photographer.
Right, yeah.
What do you got?
Is this Mr. Flint?
Yeah, this is Mr. Flint.
Listen, I was watching that damn island for 4 months. And then, one day, man, the cabana door opens and out comes Jackie O with nothing on. I mean, not a single stitch.
You're sure it's Jackie O?
Yeah, sure.
And what do you see?
You see absolutely everything. Trust me. And she's the good one. This ain't no Mamie Eisenhower or Lady Bird.
Oh, my God.
So we next see Hustler rolling off the presses and they're being covered on the TV news, and they reveal that even the Governor of Ohio has been seen buying a copy. So they've got some success at last. However, not everyone shares the same enthusiasm, and we get to meet Charles Keating, played by James Cromwell, speaking at a dinner. He introduces another speaker who wanders around the diners at the dinner, handing out copies of Hustler. We see the diners gasp in shock, and those that haven't seen a copy yet grab them to take a look so they too can get, be shocked. And it's clearly this is a dinner for decent folk who care about their children. Okay, so that they've had one failed success, one failed edition, and then bingo, they hit the jackpot. And is that quite true?
There's a bit of playing with the timeline. There were huge problems initially persuading distributors to carry the magazine. One main distributor was concerned that his members could be prosecuted, so Larry went to see the captain in charge of the obscene publications unit of that police force, gave him Hustler. He had a look at it, compared it to some other magazines the captain was humming and ahhing about, and said, actually, I don't think you got a problem, it's fine. And Larry persuaded him to call this distributor manager and just sort of explain to him, no, you can assure your people. So that was one thing. The other thing was they were running out of money, but he got on board with a national distribution company. Basically, he bought them out. he provided cash, and a guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he had national credibility as a magazine publisher. They'd use his name, Larry's money, but he couldn't. He needed to raise $500,000, which in the beginning of the 70s was a lot of money, late 60s, early 70s. So the only way he could do it was to withhold tax payments. I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but this is, the Jackie O thing did come along and was massive, but they were viable before that. He withheld taxes from Ohio State and the IRS, which enabled him to buy in to this distribution company, which enabled Hustler to go nationwide, and they just made enough money for him to pay those taxes before the deadline. He said, if they'd found out, I'd have been arrested. And he said, you could say the IRS and Ohio State accounts funded the launch of Hustler magazine, which he's pretty sure they wouldn't be too happy about. So,
and what about the James Keating character?
Charles Keating, he was a stiff-necked...
Charles Keating, thanks.
Stiff-necked, puritanical man, gave fire and brimstone speeches against people like Larry Flynt, and yet time would prove him just to be another hypocrite. He founded something, I think it was Citizens for Decent Literature or something, where, basically you're talking as a classic book burner. If this doesn't agree with my idea of what's right and wrong, burn it. It's it's heresy. He'd have gone down well with the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, more of him later, I think.
Indeed.
Back in the movie, we see Larry and Althea are in the Hustler office, where she reveals to him that he is officially now a millionaire, which isn't bad from a hillbilly kid from Kentucky now in the early 70s. The next scene, we see a huge Independence Day themed party at Larry's house, and we meet his mum and dad as they arrive to join the fun. Larry goes to show them to their room, but tells them that it's still being prepared by the maid. His mum seems impressed, but we get to see that really it's Althea and two other girls frolicking in the bedroom. Later that night, relaxing in the jacuzzi, Althea asks Larry if he's ever thought about marriage. He tells her that he loves her, but he doesn't want the restrictions that marriage brings, admitting that he still wants to bed other women. Althea is shocked that he thought that she was suggesting monogamy. No such thing, apparently. So how did they go? Did he become a millionaire that early?
He did, yeah. He was very successful very quickly, but like most, businessmen we've heard of, by definition being successful, unless of course let's not go. I was going to go down, mention presidents of the United States who maybe weren't the most successful business people, but on Larry Flynt's front, he ploughed most of it back into the business. Now, according to Larry, Althea proposed to him whilst they were driving, not in a jacuzzi, but the conversation was pretty much the same. She said, no, I don't mean monogamy, it's just a nice commitment. They did get married. The movie kind of skips over the fact that Althea became Larry's fourth wife. He'd already had 3 fairly short-lived and unhappy marriages, and he did have children from those earlier marriages, more of which later.
Yeah, indeed. So back to the movie, we immediately see the couple get married, and then we immediately cut to an editorial meeting where Althea is coming up with some concept ideas. One is of a porn Wizard of Oz parody, and as they speak, 2 official-looking men arrive and announce that they are arresting Larry for pandering obscenity in Cincinnati, Ohio, and for organised crime. We cut to jail, where Larry meets Alan Isaacman, played by Edward Norton, who tells them that he's going to be Larry's attorney, having been hired by Althea. Larry is dismissive and he thinks Alan is too young, but Alan tells him that he's very good at civil liberties, and while Alan is not comfortable around pornography, what Larry does, according to his new lawyer Alan, falls under the protection of freedom of speech and the First Amendment to the US Constitution, so he's very keen to help. After they post bail, Alan, Larry and Althea talk about the pending case, and Alan is most worried about the organised crime element of the charges. He tells Larry that he could be facing up to 25 years in jail if he's found guilty. Okay, so we've got the first arrest and meeting his lawyer and this organised crime charge. What can you tell us about that, Martin?
Right, Althea had told Larry that she could run a go-go dance club but knew nothing about magazines when he tried to recruit her to the editorial team. And this is what I think one of the underlying criticisms I have of the movie is it completely underplays Althea's role in Larry's life and the success of the magazine. He knew she could do the magazine. It forced her to sort of join the board, and immediately she proved absolutely insightful. She understood what the customers wanted. If Larry wasn't available, she would know what should be put to him for approval, what could be immediately dismissed and what could be put through. And she just had a real nous about what would work and what wouldn't. Due to the OPEC oil embargo and the crippling effect it had on the US economy, it was around this time that Hustler magazine was now subsidising the clubs and bars. So Larry sold them all off and concentrated on the magazine. Alan Isaacman, this first charge, by the way, is absolutely correct. They managed to use the organised crime laws that were brought in. I think even at this stage they were known as the RICO laws. It was a restriction of organised crime. And they were brought in to help the US law enforcement, to prosecute the mafia. But they were worded so loosely that they could apply them to anything. If they could prove that 5 or more people conspired to commit a crime, they could charge them under the organised crime laws, which held a sentence of up to 25 years. They only had 4. Charged along with Larry were Althea, Jimmy Flynt, Al, who was one of the editorial people. They needed a 5th, so Ohio State chose Hustler magazine because under a previous legal precedent, a company or a corporation could be viewed as a person, which meant it had the same rights but also the same obligations. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Finally, on this wrap-up, Alan Isaacman wouldn't arrive in Larry's life until much later. Basically, they use Alan as Larry's lawyer throughout the movie, whereas in fact there were 5 or 6 different lawyers that represented him at different stages. So Alan wouldn't come along until much later on, although he is still Larry Flynt's attorney. So, but he's very well played, and I think we can forgive him that just on simplicity and keeping down the costs of paying actors.
Indeed. Okay, back to the movie. It's 1997, and we're in court.
Sorry, it's 1977.
1977, beg your pardon. And the prosecutor of the court case, one Simon Lees, played remarkably by James Carville, is introducing the case and is apologising to the jury for the smut that they're about to have to see. Alan?
Yes, sorry.
Alan Isaacman starts the defence by asking to introduce 27 other magazines as evidence, obviously intending to ask why these other magazines haven't been prosecuted when Hustler has. The prosecutor objects, and to Alan Isaacman's amazement, Judge Morrissey sustains the objection and refuses to admit the new evidence. Incidentally, this Judge Morrissey is played by the real Larry Flynt. Alan Isaacman, Larry's lawyer, is dumbfounded but can do nothing. Larry is on the stand then, and he's asked by Lees, the prosecuting attorney, to describe a cartoon from a copy of Hustler. Larry sheepishly describes a scene where Santa Claus is talking to Mrs. Claus while holding in his hand a large erect penis. The caption reads, "This is what I've got to ho, ho, ho about." Larry challenged whether the Founding Fathers had this sort of smut in mind when they wrote the First Amendment. Larry says that no, they probably didn't, but then he mentions Playboy and People magazine, and why has he been singled out? Larry refutes the prosecutor's argument that communities should be able to set their own standards by saying that such statements are just an excuse for censorship. And if they're worried about their kids being corrupted, why don't they demand that bars are closed down every time a kid takes a sip of beer? We see the summations during which Alan Isaacman argues that while the jury are not being asked to like Larry Flynt or what he does, they are being asked to protect the freedoms of their free country. And we've got a clip of Alan summing all this up.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard a lot here today, and I'm not going to try to go back over it all again for you. But you have to go back in that room and make some decisions. And there is one thing I want to make very, very clear to you before you do. I'm not trying to convince you that you should like what Larry Flynt does. I don't like what Larry Flynt does. But what I do like is that I live in a country where you and I can make that decision for ourselves. I like that I live in a country where I can pick up Hustler magazine and read it if I want to, or throw it in the garbage can if that's where I think it belongs. Or better yet, I can exercise my opinion and not buy it. I like that I have that right. I care about it. And you should care about it too. You really should. Because we live in a free country. You know, we say that a lot, but I think sometimes we forget really what that means. So listen to it again. We live in a free country. And that is a powerful idea. That's a magnificent way to live. But there is a price for that freedom, which is that sometimes we have to tolerate things that we don't necessarily like. So go back in that room where you are free to think whatever you want to think about Larry Flynt and Hustler magazine. But then ask yourselves if you want to make that decision for the rest of us. Because the freedom that everyone in this room enjoys is in a very real way in your hands. And if we start throwing up walls against what some of us think is obscene, we may very well wake up one morning and realize that walls have been thrown up in all kinds of places that we never expected. And we can't see anything or do anything. That is not freedom. So be careful.
So how did they go in those crucial scenes? And just on James Carville that played Simon Lees, I nearly fell off my chair when I saw his name in the credits, because I don't know if you noticed, but he was Bill Clinton's principal policy advisor, a campaign manager when he won the election some 6 years earlier.
It's funny, but the movie does this all the way through, and there's a couple more examples we'll get to later on where real-life civil liberties lawyers appear as actors portraying someone who's exactly the opposite. And another example we have here is Judge Morrissey really is played by the real Larry Flynt. And
amazing.
Larry Flynt said, I just remembered what a horrible person he was and tried to play him the same way. And the thing about not allowing other pornographic magazines from being admitted for comparison purposes is absolutely true. Larry's New York lawyer, I'm afraid I didn't note his name, he was absolutely dumbfounded. He's like, but of course it's relevant. No, it's not. No, it's relevant. No, I'm the judge and I'm telling you it's not. And he was just like, well, how can we operate, under these circumstances? So yeah, and the summations are pretty accurate as well.
Excellent. All right, well, back to the movie. The jury return their verdict and Larry is found guilty on all counts. The judge asks Larry if he has anything to say before he sentences him. Larry, bullish as ever, says that the judge hasn't made a single intelligent decision all trial long, and so he doesn't expect one now. And bingo. Larry gets sentenced to 25 years prison. We then see Althea visiting him in prison and learns that Isaacman is working to get Larry out. Some 5 months later, we see a modestly attended conference in Cincinnati where Larry, obviously recently released from prison, after his conviction was overturned by the appellate court. We see Larry make a speech reminding the audience this is a conference of Americans in favour of free speech, an organisation and conference paid for by Larry himself, that publishing images of murder, a crime, is legal, whereas publishing images of sex, a legal activity, is not. Behind him we see a series of images that shows the contrast between violence in war and crime against images of naked bodies. It's a brutal trick, but it's very effective. So we've got a clip of Larry telling us what is obscene and what isn't.
And this is talking of brutal, the editing is a little bit brutal just to keep it short and obviously to cut out bits where he says, do you like this or this and this? And obviously we don't have the visuals to go with it. So yeah, let's play that.
I have a thought for you. Murder is illegal. But you take a picture of somebody committing the act of murder, they'll put you on the cover of Newsweek. You might even win a Pulitzer Prize. And yet, sex is legal. Everybody's doing it. Everybody wants to be doing it. Yet, You take a picture of two people in the act of sex, or just take a picture of a woman's naked body, and they'll put you in jail. Now, I have a message for all you good, moral, Christian people who are complaining that breasts and vaginas are obscene. Hey, don't complain to me. Complain to the manufacturer, okay? And although Jesus told us not to judge, I know you're going to judge anyway, so judge sanely. Judge with your eyes open. What do you consider obscene? Is this obscene to you? What is more obscene, sex or war?
The impression given in the movie is the jury came back pretty quickly. So despite Alan's long, his defence lawyer in the movie, it's Alan Isaacman, despite his long and passionate summation, they just sort of came straight back and went, no, guilty. In truth, they deliberated for days. And Larry and his legal team were actually worried that Judge Morrissey had basically sequestered them, was threatening them with effective incarceration until they came up with a verdict. The judge and the prosecutor obviously wanting a guilty verdict. Eventually, they did find Larry guilty of all counts, but Althea, Jimmy, Al, and Hustler magazine were not guilty. So, as Larry complains, how can I be the only one guilty of conspiracy? With whom did I conspire if it was just me? I mean, it's just so nonsense. The comment he made about the judge not making one intelligent decision is true, and this is a theme we see where you think the smart thing to do is keep your mouth shut, and he doesn't. But it's almost like, but if you took that element of him away, he probably wouldn't be the success he is. It's that bullishness that, no, I'm right, and I'm just going to keep saying it until you accept it. And as he says later on in the movie, I'm rich, which gives me the power to shake this whole system up.
And he takes that to great extremes in later scenes, as we're about to learn.
Yeah, he did start to give speeches to free expression groups, the war versus sex theme being a common one and a powerful one. So, yeah, this is very much in line. It's quite funny in the movie where Jimmy says to him, wow, this is brilliant. You know, look, you've been taken seriously, you've been invited to this conference. And Larry turns to him and goes, who do you think paid for this? I've organised it myself. And you get the idea. He's a showman, but he's also a salesman.
Okay, so back to the movie, we see Althea having a photo shoot when Arlo interrupts and he tells Larry that a Georgia state prosecutor is arresting newspaper sellers that are selling the Hustler magazine. Larry immediately takes his private jet down to Georgia. He goes into a news shop and, surrounded by TV and news media, we see Larry hire out the shop from its owner, and he sells a Hustler magazine to a customer, which is actually Arlo in disguise. And two cops promptly arrest Larry. We assume that Larry is quickly bailed, as next we see him back in the office with the editorial team proposing an offer of $1 million as a reward for information leading to who really killed JFK. Hustler also runs a monthly piece on Asshole of the Month. Althea suggests that they nominate Jerry Falwell, a TV evangelist, but Jimmy suggests that his own brother Larry should be the Asshole of the Month. Larry laughs and agrees to the idea, but because everyone thinks that he is actually an asshole. A phone call comes in for Larry from one Ruth Carter Stapleton, who turns out to be the sister of President Jimmy Carter. They speak over the phone, and Larry is amazed to be invited to meet with Mrs. Carter. So how do they go with that? Bits and pieces about him being arrested and so on. Lots
of short scenes to unpack there. Yeah, Larry did charge down to defend the Georgian distributors in the face of another puritanical prosecutor. He was arrested after a bit of a publicity stunt, but made sure that national press were there to witness and record it. They did come up with the $1 million reward for information about the JFK assassination, and in the 70s that was an awful lot of money. That was, I don't know if it was unprecedented, but certainly it was dramatic. The Asshole of the Month scene, and Larry himself being named as it, that has happened several times over the years. And what becomes clear is whatever failings the man has, an oversized ego isn't one of them. He's quite happy to laugh at himself. And bizarrely, the Ruth Carter Stapleton storyline is absolutely true. She did get in touch with him, or someone he knew, I think a TV guy he'd interviewed Larry Flynt, and had also interviewed Ruth Carter Stapleton and said, you two have got a lot in common, surprisingly, you should get together and set up this meeting. So, and through her, he did find God.
Temporarily. Let's get to that then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we see after the invitation to have dinner with Ruth Carter Stapleton, we see Larry and Althea fly down to have this dinner at Ruth's house, and they learn that while she is a devout Christian, she isn't bothered by what Larry does and the fact that he doesn't go to church, as she views things like a church visit just a ritual. She's very open-minded and non-judgmental and seems to see in Larry a possible ally. She says she believes that sexuality is a God-given gift and should be celebrated. Back at home, Larry claims that he's had an epiphany, but Althea is furious and baffled. Althea reminds Larry that her family were murdered by her father, which led to her being raised as an orphan by nuns who would beat her every day, and she is, as a result, vehemently anti-Christian. Next, we see Larry being baptised in a river, Ruth Carter Stapleton in attendance, along with a full gospel choir. Then, back in the Hustler office, Larry is telling his team that there'll be no more naked women in Hustler magazine unless they're accompanied by a naked man, in some sort of a Genesis-style image. He then suggests partly naked girls draped over glass crucifixes, and his team look stunned. Jimmy pipes up and begs his brother not to go down this route, as the company will soon be worthless. Arlo suggests that Larry must be joking and this is a scam to boost circulation. So that's a pretty quick turnaround for pornographer to devout Christian. How much truth is there in that?
Well, it's strange. I mean, he says now he's not sure if it was a manic depressive episode or a chemically induced one, but he did sort of briefly find God. He did try and make Hustler a Christian publication, although still showing girls in a state of undress. Little actually changed in the actual magazine, largely thanks to Althea's ability to dilute Larry's wilder ideas, but he certainly had them. Althea's backstory is sort of true and tragic. Her father murdered her mother, her grandfather, and her mother's best friend before shooting himself, and she went to a series of foster homes where she was almost certainly abused sexually and physically. I have not found any evidence that she went to a nunnery or to a place run by nuns, although the holding house from where they'd be farmed out to foster families may have been run by nuns. I'm not sure. But yeah, so it seems ridiculous, but it's kind of true.
Yeah, for about a year he was a strong Christian. Anyway, back to the movie. We see Larry in church again with Ruth Stapleton Carter. And they're surrounded by some ecstatic worshippers. Back at the office, we see eggs being splattered onto the window as Althea slaps the latest copy of Hustler magazine down in front of Larry. It features an image of a naked pair of legs sticking out of a meat grinder, and out the front of the meat grinder is coming some churned mince meat. It's very graphic, and according to Althea, is making people puke. Larry says it's trying to illustrate that he is no longer willing to exploit the female body. Althea laughs and tells him that he's failed miserably. She says she has no idea what's going on with Larry and his conversion, but she's always been supportive of him. However, this is going too far. Larry argues that God is working through him, and he can achieve anything. He claims that he could bring a wall down by sheer willpower, so Althea tells him to go ahead. He stares at a brick wall intently, but just then the phone rings, and it's his attorney, Alan Isaacman, who's with the Georgia District Attorney, David Salmon. Alan has some good news. Due to Larry's conversion to Christianity, the DA will cut them a plea bargain. Larry, realising that he's only getting the plea bargain because of his public conversion, switches course and tells Alan to get the grey-haired old bar steward to go bleep himself. We're going to trial, praise the Lord, and hangs up.
Yeah,
great scene.
It's a great scene, and it's like the praise the Lord bit at the end is like an afterthought. In truth, the meat grinder cover really was used. You can find images of it, and it's not pleasant. It really isn't. But that seems to have been towards the end of his Christian experiment. Possibly one of the reasons that he did leave the flock was the offer of a plea bargain from the Georgian prosecutor. Although Larry now says, no, he was always going to fight this one in court. He said, I could never take a plea bargain because that was just an admission and would set a precedent. And everybody would have gone after us then. So he said, I had no choice but to keep fighting. But yeah, I do like the, and apparently he did. He said, I don't think this was Alan Isaacman at this stage. I think this was possibly Gene Reeves, but his Georgia attorney anyway did say, we've got this offer, and he went, no, tell him to screw himself, we're going to court. I don't know if he then said, oh, praise the Lord.
Okay, so the next scene, we're in court, and Larry is asked how he, as a good Christian, can defend the filth that he publishes. Larry launches into another analogy. I don't have to defend it because it's not illegal. It may not be the smartest thing to have too much to drink, but it's not illegal. As he speaks, we see a middle-aged man enter an old warehouse near the court. The man starts to assemble a rifle as Larry continues speaking. Larry and Alan then leave the courthouse as reporters are seeking a quote from them. The unknown gunman fires several shots at both Larry and Alan are hit. The gunman escapes as the two victims are loaded into an ambulance. We see Althea arrive at the hospital and is obviously distraught. Larry is lying in a bed with tubes coming out of his body and the inevitable machine beeping in the background. Althea reveals to Larry that he is now paralysed from the waist down. As Althea cries, Ruth Carter arrives. She tries to persuade Larry that he hasn't been abandoned by God, but Larry doesn't seem so sure. When Ruth says that God will see him through this ordeal, Larry looks her in the eye and says, there is no God. We then see Althea arrive at the Hustler offices and declares that the reign of Christian terror is over and they're going back to porn.
Yeah.
So,
well, the reality, he was going down for, I think it was a pre-trial hearing, and he and his local lawyer Gene Reeves were shot by what was then an unknown gunman. Again, we've got Alan Isaacman basically is being used as the sole lawyer all the way through. Now, after the movie was made, serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a white supremacist, right-wing, fundamental Christian serial killer, he confessed to shooting Larry Flynt, but he was already on death row at the time and he wasn't prosecuted. There's no way of knowing if he told the truth, but most people accept it as a fact now. And Franklin was executed by lethal injection in 2013, and it's thanks to Christina Dockstarter, who sent us some fabulous information, that Christina gave us that nugget which allowed me to shoot off down the rabbit hole. So yeah, so he was shot.
And was his lawyer, or even though it wasn't Alan, it was this Gene Reeves. And I think Gene Reeves did survive unscathed at the end, whereas Larry Flynt, as the movie shows, became paralysed as a result, at least from the waist down.
Yeah, Gene he nearly died, but he survived and did make a full recovery.
Right. Okay, so back in the movie, Larry is being driven back home in a car with Althea, Jimmy, Arlo, and Alan, his lawyer. They speculate about who the assassin was, or at least who he might have represented. Larry states that he needs to move somewhere that welcomes perverts. So next we see a pastiche of Los Angeles before cutting to Larry in bed, begging Althea to shoot him up, presumably with morphine or maybe heroin, to help with his pain. After she injects him, thinking that he's asleep, Althea gives herself a shot too. But Larry is awake and sees her do it, and we get a feeling that they're both in trouble due to drug addictions.
Yeah, the reality was that Larry, Althea and Hustler magazine had actually moved to Los Angeles 2 months before the shooting, so it wasn't as a result of the shooting, but he did say he was just too easy a target in Ohio and he'd had enough of the stiff-necked conservatives there. The dependency on drugs to try and alleviate the pain in is very true, and at some stage Althea started to join in or possibly return to a previously existing habit. His injuries were the worst of both worlds. A bullet had damaged a bundle of nerves at the base of his spine, but they hadn't severed his spinal cord, so although they removed the ability to control his legs, they didn't remove sensation, and he described the pain as being like having his legs in boiling water permanently. I mean, it was really, really horrendous, and yeah, the worst of both. I mean, my mother-in-law is paralysed after an operation she had a couple of years ago from the chest down, but she's got no sensation, so she said, it's not like I'm hurting, it's just she can't use them. So to lose the motor power but to still have sensation is really cruel.
Yeah, that is. Okay, back to the movie. We see the action jumping from spring of 1979 to spring of 1983. Larry's bedroom is now protected behind some sort of steel vault-like doors. His doctor arrives and we see that Larry is still in dreadful pain. He's bearded and looking pretty bedraggled. Althea, who looks equally dishevelled, gives the doctor $30,000 in cash and asks him to just give them their drugs. The doctor tells Larry about a new operation that has proved successful for precisely his type of injury. And so immediately we see Larry going under the surgeon's knife, or more accurately, the surgeon's laser. Althea arrives to see Larry, Althea is amazed that he doesn't feel any pain. He's clean-shaven, he's had a haircut, and he looks transformed already. Althea appears drunk or maybe high. She's stolen some flowers from a nearby patient for him and is taken aback when Larry says he doesn't want any drugs, just as she is offering him a tablet. She says that after 4 or 5 years of being on drugs, she can't believe that he feels fine. But Larry points out that he only took the drugs because of his pain, and now that he is pain-free, he doesn't want drugs. And Althea is going to have to give them up too. She pleads that she can't. Larry says he wants his mind back. So is that bit about the radical surgery true?
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't one operation though, it was a series, and it was experimental operations using lasers to destroy the damaged ends of nerves that were causing the pain. And there is a name for this, which unfortunately I didn't note down, and it's a medical term for this particular type of injury. Quite unusual or quite rare, but the lasers were used so carefully that he actually went up, I think it was 5 or 6 times he had to go back. But he said it went from legs in boiling water to legs in slightly uncomfortably hot water to legs in warm water to, okay, now I'm not feeling anything. And he felt pain-free for the first time in about 5 years. I'm not sure if Althea would have been angry with the fact that he didn't want drugs anymore, but she did struggle to get off the ones that they sustained the couple for the years since the shooting. And he's said that in the early days of after his injury, she basically kept the magazine going, but gradually she became less and less able to contribute, and the team kept it going. So it was still there. Hustler magazine was still being successful, but he said he'd had very little input, whereas he used to micromanage it. But the pain meant he had no interest in it.
Okay, so post-operation, we see Larry in a wheelchair arrive at his luxurious Hustler offices. He tells the receptionist Sophie to announce to everybody that the pervert is back. We see Larry chairing a board meeting where he berates his team. The magazine circulation has dropped hugely and he is furious. A new face pipes up that things have changed since he was last running the company, and under the Reagan administration, America has changed accordingly. Larry isn't interested and fires the guy on the spot with a lot of expletives. His brother Jimmy leaps up and tells Larry, "You can't do that. That man is our head of vice president of marketing." Larry shouts him down and Jimmy backs down as well. Arlo then asks Larry what's the plan. Larry says he's going to get back at the establishment that ended up having him shot. He calls a CBS News producer and tells him that Larry has a video of the FBI selling a suitcase full of cocaine to John DeLorean. Larry then shows the producer the video taken on a hidden camera. So next we jump to a court case where the FBI are trying to block CBS from airing that video. As the case continues, Arlo brings in a page from the next Hustler edition for Larry's approval. In it, they're running a spoof campaign of a Campari ad that was running around about this time, where celebrities would talk about their first time. The real adverts were about the celebrity's first time drinking a Campari, although with an obvious double entendre. But Hustler are running this parody magazine as if it was really about the subject's first experience of sex, not an alcoholic drink. And the target of this parody is Jerry Falwell, the TV evangelist. Larry laughs, but the phone rings and Alan Isaacman tells Larry that he's being subpoenaed to reveal the source of his FBI DeLorean video. Larry's response is that he's going to wipe his ass with their subpoena, and the judge then issues a warrant for Larry's arrest. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Do you want to give it a crack?
Yeah, the pervert is back announcement is probably true, depending on who you believe, as is the fury that Larry unleashed on some on the board of the magazine, although the man scene being fired in the movie is just probably representative of a mood rather than a specific incident. Larry,
They jump
Go on.
to this. They jump to this DeLorean video all of a sudden. It's such a rapid departure. I guess it must be true.
Yeah, it was. John DeLorean had a car company. He was a British businessman, but based in America. If anyone's seen the original Back to the Future movie,
Back to the Future.
That's a DeLorean that they use in there, the car. They got into financial difficulty, and he was desperately trying to keep his company afloat, and he was approached by someone saying, you can buy from us because you can use your car distribution network to sell these drugs, and it was like 60 kilograms or something of cocaine. He was very reluctant, tried to get out of the deal a few times, and was told by the guy that he was dealing with that he could either go through with it or his daughter would get badly hurt. And it turned out it was a massive FBI sting. Talk about entrapment. Fairly badly bungled. I don't know if video surveillance or hidden video was a new concept at the time, but they were a little bit amateurish. So Larry's managed to obtain a video of it, and so that bit's true. It's around the same time that the Campari ad spoof featuring Jerry Falwell did get published, and Larry really was subpoenaed to reveal the source of the FBI video, which now you'd think, you're not going to reveal your source, are you? I mean, that's sort of so enshrined, but this was different times.
Okay, so back to the movie, we see Larry barricading himself inside his Beverly Hills home. Some federal marshals arrive, armed and angry, and they force their way in. Larry has alerted the media, and once he's ready, he wheels himself out of his fortress bedroom to be arrested. A clearly wasted Althea casually asks him if he can get some bananas while he's out. In court, Larry says he cannot swear on the Bible as he is an atheist. The judge asks him simply to affirm his answers, which he agrees. Then the judge asks Larry to name the source of the video. Larry launches into a lengthy anecdote despite Alan Isaacman's efforts to keep him on track. Eventually, the judge asks Larry if this story has a point. Larry admits that it hasn't, and it's got no relevance, but it's a good story nonetheless. Larry refuses to answer the original question about his source, at which point the judge orders him to pay $10,000 a day until he reveals his source. So Larry is quickly becoming a celebrity cause, surrounded by media as he arrives the next day. He's dressed in a flak jacket, a steel GI helmet, and has an American flag shaped into a diaper. And Larry then has several scantily clad girls dump the $10,000 in front of the judge, and they're all in $1 bills. And yelling at the same time, Larry tells us that it's his right to protect his sources. The judge has Larry arrested for desecrating the American flag, and he sets bail at $50,000 and says he'd prefer a cashier's check next time. Judge Mantke also stipulates that Larry is not to leave the state of California. So we've got Larry's response to all of this in the next clip.
Yeah, and in this clip, when you hear Alan Isaacman shouting, "Larry, Larry," the scene has jumped from the court to a private airfield, just to give you some context.
Mr. Flynt, is that an American flag you have on there, sir?
I have fashioned this American flag into a diaper because if you're going to treat me like a baby, I'm going to act like one.
Larry Flynt, I'm ordering you arrested for desecration of the American flag. Marshal, take him into custody.
Your Honor, we'd like to post bond if that's all right with you. Hey, hold on. Take it easy. Take it easy.
All right, just a minute, Marshal. Very well, Mr. Isaacman. Court will set a bond on Mr. Larry Flynt for $50,000. And this time, sir, I'd prefer a cashier's check.
Understood. Understood.
Furthermore, I'm going to keep our Mr. Flynt here under a very tight leash. And so as a condition of his bond, he absolutely cannot leave the state of California.
Larry! Hey! Larry! Hey. Larry, you're not getting on that plane.
Yes, I am.
No, you're not. Don't do it. Do you think this is some kind of a game we're playing?
Yeah, you're right. It's a joke. 5.5 years since they shot me, and the government.
Hey, I was there too. All right.
You remember? You don't see me running around pissing off everybody we're trying to get to help us.
Yeah, well, you can walk, and I'm in this chair. And I got money, okay? I got money, and that gives me the power to shake up this system, Dougie.
Well, find somebody else to help you then. Because this is not what I signed on for. I don't even know what we're engaged in anymore, Larry. If you get on that plane, I quit.
Alan, don't be so melodramatic. You don't want to quit me. I'm your dream client. I'm the most fun, I'm rich, and I'm always in trouble.
Hey, go to hell, Larry. Go to hell.
Bye.
So, yeah, quite a lot to unpack there. The court scenes shown in this phase of the movie are representative of a lot of court cases in which Larry Flynt appeared, or at least some incidents that happened during these cases. The demand that he reveal the source really did happen. He really was held in contempt, and he really was fined $10,000 a day until he coughed up the source. He said he'd keep paying that until he ran out of money, because he just didn't think it was right to be told he had to reveal his source. The throwing of oranges did happen, but not here. The US flag was used as a diaper, but again, not actually at this instance. But Larry really did wear a t-shirt with the legend, "Bleep this court." Bleep word starts with an F. He was ordered to remove it by marshals. He refused, daring them to wrestle it from a wheelchair-bound man who wasn't even the accused. But eventually they compromised and he agreed to wear a jacket covering it. Of course, as soon as he was allowed back in court, he took the jacket off. And he did appear wearing a helmet and a flak jacket at one point. The payment in mainly $1 bills is also true, although the judge, which in reality was slightly amused US District Judge Robert Takagumi, he was quite a character in his own right. He said to Larry, if you want to give it in $1 bills, that's fine, but you can count it yourself. So there was some Robert Takagumi, you get the impression he was actually quite impressed with Larry Flynt's legal mind and his arguments, but he still had, well, the law is the law, and he was determined to win these battles.
So, in other words, they do amalgamate several court cases into one, but all of the key events are pretty accurate within that portrayal. Okay, so now we're back in court, and we see Larry again wearing his F This Court t-shirt. He apologises to the judge for leaving the state, but says he'll now reveal his source for the video of the John DeLorean sting. He says it was a samurai who's now in Beijing receiving acupuncture treatment for a groin strain. The judge, fully aware that he's being played, starts to yell at Larry that he's out of order as Alan tries to curb Larry's self-destructive ranting. The scene culminates in Larry being grappled by two marshals, howling and yelling as Judge Mankay sentences him to 9 months in prison. Larry roars, "Is that all you got?" And for that, the judge gives him another 3 months into a federal psychiatric unit. His request for bail is immediately refused, so he's going to a federal psychiatric prison.
Yeah, now, the truth of that, I'm not sure if Larry Flynt really did break an order not to leave California, and it seems unlikely because he was living in LA by then, but he certainly did have a habit of ignoring court orders that he disagreed with. During one of the court arguments, Althea also ended up in a physical fight with a court martial who later needed treatment for a bite to his arm. Althea wasn't charged over the incident, but she did have to agree to behave. But Larry was sent to a psychiatric unit, and he was diagnosed with a bipolar condition, but he was soon discharged and the contempt of court charges were dropped, as was the request for him to reveal the source of the video.
Okay. So back in the movie, Larry is now in a straitjacket and being wheeled on a gurney into a cell. Meanwhile, we see the Liberty Baptist College, where two young men bring a copy of Hustler to Jerry Falwell's assistant. Hustler have run the My First Time Campari spoof. The assistant is confused until the two young men point out that the article claims that Falwell's first time was having sex with his own mother in an outhouse. We see the three men enter Falwell's office, and we meet the TV evangelist for the first time, played by Richard Paul. Falwell asks them to wait a moment as he's reading the good book. He closes the book and they show him the article, and we see his expression as he reads the article, goes from shocked to angry. Meanwhile, Althea has arrived to see Larry in the psychiatric prison. She reveals to Larry that she has AIDS, and now the people at Hustler magazine don't talk to her or even shake her hand. Then at the Hustler offices, we see Larry calls a conference over the phone. He fires all of them over the phone and tells them it's all over for them. Jimmy, his brother, asks him what he means, but Larry just hangs up. Jimmy assures the team that they're not being fired and life can go on. We next see Althea arrive at Alan's office, the lawyer's office, and she gives him a letter and asks advice. Alan suggests that they give the lawyer to whoever is Larry's lawyer, but Althea tells them that Alan is still their lawyer, always was, always will be, despite what Larry has told him. Okay, so we're moving the action now to the Jerry Falwell stuff.
Indeed, and the Jerry Falwell piece was published around the same time as the DeLorean video case, so the movie's been pretty faithful to the real timeline. Falwell's an interesting character to have tangled with Larry, largely due to similar backgrounds. Larry Flynt was a Kentucky hillbilly, in his own words, who'd been a bootlegger. Falwell was from Virginia and the son of a bootlegger. And as Larry Flynt said in an LA Times article entitled "My Friend Jerry Falwell," years later they did become friends, although they disagreed about a lot of topics, but recognised that each of them was selling something. In Larry's case, a pornographic magazine, in Jerry's, salvation of the soul. But they were both making a pile of money out of their respective industries, and they recognised the value each had to the other to provide the enemy outside the gates to their own congregations. They agreed to go on a debating tour together after the 97 Larry King Show debate, which made them very strange bedfellows. Larry Flynt says that if he ever did tell everyone that they were all fired, he didn't mean it and he can't remember it. This is the call to the Hustler magazine, and pretty much everyone ignored it. Althea did contract AIDS, and it's quite possibly from a blood transfusion she had during a hysterectomy, because blood wasn't being screened in the beginning of the 80s as awareness of AIDS, it was only just starting to rise. But both Larry and Althea attest that she always used clean needles when injecting drugs. But yeah, I mean, and she seems to have gone straight to pretty much full-blown AIDS, so she's becoming very poorly.
Yeah. Okay, so back in the movie, we see Alan arrive at the psychiatric unit, and he tells Larry about the letter. Jerry Falwell is suing for libel and infliction of emotional distress. Larry is chuckling to himself, and he says that what they'll do is they'll countersue. We see Falwell being made up for a TV appearance when he's told of the countersuit. Of course, he can't understand what's going on, but he's told because he republished the Hustler magazine in his church's fundraising literature without Flynt's permission, it's a breach of copyright. Alan and Larry are on their way to court in a prison van, with Alan desperately trying to persuade Larry that he has to play it smarter than last time and not lose his temper, or they'll lose this very important case. Okay, how do they go on those scenes?
Yeah, well, the precise time and date that Alan Isaacman arrived in Larry's legal team is quite hard to pin down, but he was young, idealistic and enthusiastic, and he is brilliantly played by Ed Norton. You really get the feeling that, you know, this is very true. Now, there was a defence lawyer called Kenneth Kahn who was consulted by the movie makers to get these next court scenes really accurate, the Georgian court scenes that we're coming to. But he sued the movie makers later because he'd been told he would be represented, and in fact they got Alan Isaacman, as we've already mentioned, being the lawyer for the entire movie. That case was settled out of court. So yeah, back to the movie in Virginia, which of course is Jerry Falwell's home state, and that's where he's chosen to take Larry to court.
Yes, and we're in fact in Roanoke, Virginia, and it's 1984. Alan is asking Falwell, who's in the dock, about his leadership of an organisation known as the Moral Majority. Falwell agrees that he's the moral majority leader, so Alan asks him if he actually has ever had sex with his mother in an outhouse. Falwell falls straight into Alan's trap. No one could reasonably believe, Falwell tells us, that he would even preach while having few too many drinks, let alone something as heinous as incest. Falwell eagerly agrees, at which point Alan reminds him, and of course the jury, that the judge has said that the libel claim can only hold up if Hustler's allegations could be reasonably believed. Next, Falwell's lawyer is questioning Larry, who's in the stand. He asks Larry if he had any evidence about Falwell committing incest. Larry says no. Asked if he is deliberately holding Falwell up to ridicule, Larry says no, he's holding him up for contempt. Larry freely admits that he's trying to show the Reverend to be a hypocrite and a fraud. We see Larry getting cleared of libel, but guilty of inflicting emotional distress on Falwell, and he's got to cough up $200,000 for damages. Larry appears to have lost, but is released from his latest prison visit and gets to go home. Then, arriving back at his office, Larry asks Jimmy why everyone's still there when he had fired them over the phone. Jimmy appears nervous, but Larry just ends up hugging him and tells everyone to just shake Althea's hand. She looks awful, ill and pale, and we fear the worst for her.
Yeah. Despite the truth of that, despite the apparent reasonableness of the legal arguments given by, in this case, Kenneth Kahn on behalf of Larry Flynt and Hustler, the Virginian jury did find in favour of Falwell on the grounds of hurt feelings, but they did dismiss the libel accusation. It was at this point that a number of major US publishing institutions started to become alarmed at the possible consequences of what could become a precedent. If the subject of an article, an allegation, or even a comedy sketch or cartoon didn't have to prove any facts, only that the piece hurt their feelings, then they realised that would effectively become an end of free speech. This suddenly takes on a new dimension.
Yeah, and that's why these court proceedings are so important and so precedent-setting, but we'll get to that in a moment. Back in the movie, in their bedroom, Althea goes for a bath, Larry giving her a lift on his lap on his wheelchair into the bathroom. We see Althea shut the door as Larry goes to his desk and calls the doctor to tell him that Althea doesn't look good. He then notices some water flowing under the bathroom door and wheels himself back into the bathroom to find Althea drowned, and he's clearly distraught. Next, we see Larry, Jimmy, Alan, and the team at Althea's graveside as we hear a minister say some kind words. Later on TV, we see Jerry Falwell preaching. He's saying that AIDS is a punishment from God. Larry calls Alan and tells him that he wants to appeal the decision against Falwell. Alan argues that it's over, but Larry tells them they still can appeal to the Supreme Court. Alan tells Larry that thousands of cases are referred to the Supreme Court, and although he believes that they've got a great case, they'll never pick him because he shows no respect for the institution of American justice. Larry argues, but Alan says he's not going to be put in the situation again of fighting with his own client as much as he's fighting the opposition in a courtroom. Larry appeals to their friendship, telling him that he wants to be remembered for something meaningful. Meanwhile, we see Charles Keating, the moralising man we met earlier in the movie, and he's arrived at Falwell's lawyer's office with a stack of Hustler magazines and a pledge of support for Falwell's side, referring to Larry as filth. Okay, so Althea's passed on. How do they get that? How do they go with that?
Well, the circumstances of her death have been disputed over the years. She did take a heroin overdose and drowned in the bath, though almost certainly due to unconsciousness due to the overdose. That element is not disputed, and there's never really been any sort of serious suggestion of foul play. However, the version given by Larry Flynt, that he called for their nurse to go and check on her as the bath had been running a long time, is disputed. The nurse herself later said that he was asleep and she just went and checked herself and found her. The movie version of Larry finding her and dragging her from the water is definitely a fiction. Alan Isaacman, who definitely was Larry's attorney by this case, saying that hardly anyone gets their case in front of the Supreme Court is true, but Larry had actually been there once before, which is not shown in the movie. Excuse me. This was Keaton versus Hustler magazine, and this established that a complainant could sue a publication even if neither of them resided in the state in which the case was brought, provided the publication received, quote, widespread distribution in that state. Kathy Keaton was a publisher of Penthouse magazine and sued Hustler for libel after an article the magazine published about her. She chose New Hampshire for her case, as the statute of limitations was the longest and they had strict privacy laws, and she later received $2 million from Hustler in compensation, so clearly won her case. So the decision to appeal to the Supreme Court was always going to be taken according to Larry Flynt in his autobiography. The timeline just doesn't fit that this was a reaction to Falwell preaching that AIDS was God's punishment against, homosexuality and drug users and the like. Although he definitely did use that argument or preach that sermon. So I don't think Larry did it because of anger and hatred of Jerry Falwell. Falwell, interestingly, he also warned parents that the Teletubby character Tinky Winky was a subversive representation of a gay character against whom children should be protected. And I believe Tinky Winky was removed from the Teletubbies lineup at one stage, which is extraordinary.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Now, another of those interesting seeing who's playing different parts. Jerry Falwell's attorney is a man called Norman Roy Grootman. He's played by Bert Newborn, who was a real attorney and law professor and actually assisted in preparing this case, but not for Jerry Falwell, for Larry Flynt. And again, that tidbit it was brought to us by Christina Dockstader. So Christina, thank you for that. It's brilliant.
Movie trivia gold, isn't it?
They've had some fun with the casting here, definitely. So the events portrayed in the Supreme Court are actually very accurately shown, and the arguments, which we'll get to now, and the general mood of the watching media seem to be pretty well done. So, back to the movie.
So we cut to a reporter who's outside the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has agreed to hear Falwell versus Flynt. And the reporter's telling her viewers that Larry has had support from the New York Times, the American Newspapers Publishing Association, and many other media organisations. So this is serious stuff. It's 1987 in Washington, D.C., and the 9 Supreme Court judges are sitting to hear arguments. Alan Isaacman receives a visual signal from Larry that it's his floor and Larry will keep stum. Alan then argues that Hustler produced a satire of a public figure. One of the Supreme Court judges asks why it's in the public interest to ridicule such a man as Falwell. Alan answers that Falwell is allowed to warn people not to buy Hustler, so Hustler should be allowed to suggest that Falwell is full of BS. To bring him down to their level, which Alan admits is pretty low, this gets a laugh from everyone in the court. Another judge brings up a concern that anyone entering public life can be held up to ridicule. He asks if George Washington would have entered public life if he had the same concerns, and we've got a clip of Alan's response to this.
A political cartoon that's over 200 years old. It depicts George Washington riding on a donkey, being led by a man, and the caption suggests that this man is leading an ass to Washington.
I can handle that. I think George can handle that. But that's a far cry from committing incest with your mother in an outhouse. I mean, there's no line between the two?
No, Justice Scalia. I would say there is no line between the two, because really what you're talking about is a matter of taste and not law. As you yourself said, I believe, in Pope versus Illinois, it's useless to argue about taste and even more useless to litigate it. And that is the case here. The jury has already determined for us that this is a matter of taste and not a matter of law, because they've said that there is no libelous speech, that nobody could reasonably believe that Hustler was actually suggesting that Jerry Falwell had sex with his mother.
So why did Hustler have him and his mother together?
Hustler puts him and his mother together in a example of literary travesty, if you will.
And what public purpose does this serve?
Well, it serves the same public purpose as having Gary Trudeau say that Reagan has no brain or that George Bush is a wimp. It lets us look at public figures a little bit differently. We have a long tradition in this country of satiric commentary. Now, if Jerry Falwell can sue when there has been no libelous speech purely on the grounds of emotional distress, then so can other public figures. And imagine, if you will, suits against people like Gary Trudeau and Johnny Carson for what he says on the Tonight Show tonight. Obviously, when people criticize public figures, they're going to experience emotional distress. We all know that. It's the easiest thing in the world to claim, and it's impossible to refute, and that's what makes it a meaningless standard. Really, all it does is allow us to punish unpopular speech. And this country is founded, at least in part, on the firm belief that unpopular speech is absolutely vital to the health of our nation.
Thank you, Mr. Isaacman.
Yeah, and that George Washington analogy is accurate. Alan Isaacman did use it, and the mood in the Supreme Court, it's quite light-hearted. Interestingly,
Yeah.
I did read a thing about which cases they generally select, and you could have a really, really powerful case that only really affects yourself and the outcome, and they're unlikely to take that. The Supreme Court select cases to hear that will have profound legal precedents for lots of other cases, specific or generally ones which affect the Constitution or constitutional definitions, and that's, I think, why it's suggested in the article I read, that is why they selected Hustler magazine versus Falwell.
Oh, okay, well, let's get back to the legal action then. In the movie now, we're outside the court and we see Falwell telling the assembled media that he's totally confident of victory, as there's no way the Supreme Court will come down the side of a sleaze merchant like Larry Flynt. Almost in response, we see Larry telling his media posse that if the Constitution and the First Amendment will protect a scumbag like him, then the general public can be assured that it will protect all of them as well. Asked if he has any regrets, Larry answers only one, and then we cut to his empty house with Althea's voice and laughter ringing through it. We see Larry lying on their bed watching old videos of him and Althea dancing. Next, we see Alan calling Larry and reveals that the Supreme Court has decided and that it's a unanimous decision. And we get a clip of Alan telling Larry the result.
Hello.
It's Alan. They just brought the decision in.
Well, is it good or bad?
Well, it's a unanimous decision, Larry, and Rehnquist wrote it himself.
Is it good or bad?
Yeah, I want you to hear this. At the heart of the First Amendment is the recognition of the fundamental importance of the free flow of ideas. Freedom to speak one's mind is not only an aspect of individual liberty, but essential to the quest for truth and the vitality of society as a whole. In the world of debate about public affairs, many things done with motives that are less than admirable are nonetheless protected by the First Amendment.
So we won.
Yes, we did. We won.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Don't mention it.
So the movie's now wrapping up and we get some words on the screen informing us that Larry still lives in Los Angeles and is publishing 29 magazines and is still confined to a wheelchair. We also learned that his assailant was never brought to justice. Alan Isaacman still lives in LA and is still Larry's lawyer. We also learned that Jerry Falwell remains one of America's most respected religious figures. And we learned that Charles Keating was a central figure in the Lincoln savings and loan scandal, which cost US taxpayers $2 billion. And the movie ends.
Yep. So the final phases, again, all pretty accurately portrayed, including the quote by Chief Justice Rehnquist, something that's stood ever since and is now held up as one of the Supreme Court's most significant verdicts. Larry Flynt is still alive today. He's age 77, and he's the publisher of it's around 30 magazines, I think, most of which are special interest titles, and that's not a euphemism. They're only very few of adult content. They're special technical magazines mainly. Jerry Falwell died in 2007, but he did remain a prominent religious leader until his death. Alan Isaacman is also 77, the same as Larry. He's alive and still practicing law from his Beverly Hills offices, primarily in business litigation. After the Lincoln savings collapse, Charles Keating was convicted and jailed for conspiracy, fraud and racketeering in the early 90s. He served 4 years before his charges were overturned for lesser charges, and he was released due to time already served, and he died in 2014, aged 90. Now, on Larry Flynt, there does need to be some balance, as the movie and much of our research has been very much from a pro-Flynt perspective, at least as far as the court battles go, if not for business activities and personal characteristics. Woody Harrelson is just a very likeable actor, or for most people at least. Certainly I find him so, and having him play Larry Flynt immediately sets him as a sympathetic character. Someone like, and I was trying to think of a suitable alternative, the late Philip Seymour Hoffman might have made it a much more ambiguous portrayal. Larry Flynt has several children. One daughter died in a 2014 car crash, very much an adult. She was in her 40s. Another daughter is estranged after she became a Christian anti-pornography campaigner and alleged in a 1998 book entitled Hustled that her father had sexually abused her. Larry Flynt has always denied this and claims he has a tape of her admitting she only made the allegations to get money. His relationship with Althea is possibly more fiery than the movie portrays. There's one scene in the movie where he doesn't punch her, but he pushes her away from him during an argument, and she is furious about it. But apparently the couple fought physically on several occasions. And that brings us to Althea Leisure Flynt and her portrayal by Courtney Love. I mean, she comes across as one would imagine a Courtney Love portrayed character would. Totally loyal, but very much in the shadow of Larry. She's, you know, the rock chick to his lead singer persona, which is kind of has parallels with her real life. In reality, Althea was far more capable, as we've mentioned, far more prominent than just Larry's companion. Yes, without him, she probably wouldn't have had the opportunities in publishing she got, but once given the opportunity, she showed a remarkable talent for judgment and communication. And it's hard avoiding the feeling that the movie did her a serious injustice. You know, someone like, I don't know, Winona Ryder or Julia Roberts, I think, could have given a much more accurate portrayal. That's just my opinion. Charlize Theron, although probably a bit young for mid-90s movies. But you found out something interesting about Milos Forman approaching Courtney Love.
Yeah, it was either Milos Forman or one of the producers of the movie were interested in casting her in the role, but they said, you know, given her rock and roll reputation and lifestyle, where she was heavily dependent on drugs at the time, that she would have to be clean and stay clean for the length of the movie. And Courtney Love says that gave her the incentive to actually straighten herself out. I think her husband had been dead for Kurt Cobain for a couple of years at this stage, and it got her off drugs, it got her sober, and she was well regarded in the role on the set and all that stuff. But that stern talking to getting her onto this movie got her clean so that she could play somebody in the movie who was anything but. So that's an interesting aside, I guess.
Yeah, it's difficult to know, isn't it? But the summary, I think there's a lack of explanation of some of the legalities. The organised crime thing is sort of mentioned, but they don't really go into the ridiculousness of how it could have been brought, the moral corruption of a lot of these courts where they had so much leeway, which thankfully has now been curtailed. I think it's a very, very important movie, and I really like watching Woody Harrelson because he's just, I like him. He just strikes me as he's a good guy. I don't know in reality, but the parts he plays. So it's at least a 7, but I'm...
For what? For accurate? For entertainment?
No, for entertainment.
Yeah, I think it was. I'm glad that Christina suggested it because I completely ignored it until then. It's good to watch. It's not the best movie I've ever seen. I think 7 is good. Watch it and be entertained by it. But as far as historical accuracy goes, I mean, it's quite accurate in the nuts and bolts. Compresses time and stuff, which we've talked about before. I think it's reasonably quite accurate. The only thing I would say it downplays is the significance of the final trial. They say that the New York Times is behind it and Associated Press is behind it. I mean, that just hints at how significant and precedent-setting the final court case, the Falwell case, is. They could have made a lot more of that, I think, especially all these years later, how it still stands and dictates the way that comedy shows, as you've already said, and popular culture can treat individuals, and they've got no real recourse because it's the trade-off they've made. They've decided to be in the public eye, and they can't complain when the public eye turns critical of them. And it was all set by the president of this trial, from what I understand.
Yeah, so I think in both entertainment and history, it's a missed opportunity to a degree, but it does raise... It's a movie that's worth watching and getting into just for the importance of what messages it or the thought process that it brings up, but they're not specifically addressed by the movie. Yeah, I don't know. I think a 7 is as high as I could go again, really.
I think so too, which shouldn't put people off from watching it or thinking that it's historically inaccurate. It's worth a watch, and it's pretty close, blow by blow, but they could have, I think it's a missed opportunity more than anything else.
Yeah, and it is entertaining, and you very much will, most people I think will associate with Alan Isaacman and his frustration at this self-destructive client he's got who just won't keep his mouth shut, and that seems to be Larry Flynt. But talking of the things that it leads you to, I'm just going to go into a bit of a monologue on the idea that people haven't got anything better to do than listen to us. And it just got me, because we've had quite a period since denial and I've had a lot of time to think, I kind of went down this analogies and implications route. And one thing, I mean, free speech is the main thing, but it just led me down. I'm going to start off with thinking about general citizens' freedoms, and the first one is ID cards. And the reason I'm starting with this is this conversation I've heard over the years. Now, bear in mind, I spent 22 years in the British Army, so there was if you're going to generalise about a population, it was fairly much, conformist and, traditional sort of, I wouldn't say right-wing, left-wing, that's I don't think that's really applicable, but conservative with a small c. And I used to think, like a lot of people, national ID card, I've got no problem with that, I don't intend to commit crimes. So here's my analogy. Imagine this situation, which I don't think is beyond the realms of possibility. A national ID, incidentally, Britain doesn't have a national ID. There's no such thing. Some countries do, some don't. A national ID scheme is proposed by the incumbent moderate government in response to demands by nationalist groups and in an attempt to retain popularity in the face of a serious challenge by an emerging far-right political party. Most of the population say, yep, I've got nothing to hide, I've got no problem with an ID card, and it's introduced. Each card carries biometric information to prevent identity theft. The cards also have the ability to be tracked, so anyone can definitely ensure that they're eliminated from a criminal investigation because the police can determine where they were. In the light of current events, this would also allow authorities to ensure that people are observing social distancing when required, etc. So everyone goes, yep, no, that's a couple of misgivings, but it seems fair enough. To support this initiative, there's also a population-wide DNA base introduced to further assist the police in the investigation of crime, and especially terrorism, and the fear of that is used to persuade people that's okay. However, due to a global economic downturn, the incumbent government are ousted and the hard right party are elected on a platform of putting their own citizens first. They drastically cut immigration, step up the repatriation of unsuccessful asylum seekers, which is by now nearly everybody, and public assure their citizens that the current economic woes are not their fault, but are down to immigration, which has been promoted by the global, and you can come up with any conspiracy you want, Masonic, Catholic, Muslim, Communist, Jewish, whatever, in the expectation of causing social unrest and disruption. Due to the DNA database, the new government are able to identify anyone who has less than 65% of their genetic inheritance originating within their own country. So such people who don't meet that line are rounded up and sent to confinement camps, a new term coined to avoid traditional terms which are deemed too emotive. Of course, anyone found without an ID card, such as an illegal immigrant, is also rounded up and carted off to a camp. And we have a new Holocaust, made far more efficient by modern science and possibly through our willingness to allow a significant intrusion into our privacy, which when first proposed by a moderate liberal government seemed positive and harmless. I mean, you can sound like a nutjob conspiracy theorist with such a dystopian vision of the future, but I don't think that's beyond the realms of possibility. So now I am vehemently against the idea of a national ID card, when for years I just thought, well, it doesn't affect me, I wouldn't be bothered. So that leads us to the free speech analogy, and this is really where it gets difficult. There's a similar danger with the ongoing conflict between advocates of free speech and guardians of morality. It has to be acknowledged that what constitutes moral or ethical behaviour will vary wildly from one person to the next, but it does seem in recent years there's been a growing movement to try and control the descriptive terms for particular groups of people. Quite understandably, terms like Red Indian and Negro have become beyond the pale for most people because they're based only on colour of skin, and an inaccurate one at that. But also, we've had legal challenges recently to the validity of identifying humans by only one of two genders, i.e. male or female. A UK legal challenge seeking to allow passporters to list as a holder as male, female or X was rejected by the High Court in March of this year. But such a scheme has been introduced in Germany, Canada and Australia. Other campaigners have said I just read this article, the British Army should introduce a third term of address for officers other than sir for male and ma'am for female. This has also been rejected, but this is what people are becoming concerned about. And in a recent case, not quite as significant as Larry Flynt, but similarly, a retired British police officer, Harry Miller, was investigated by police for a possible hate incident against transgender people. He'd made several sort of comic tweets, the most quoted being, he tweeted, and I quote, "I was assigned mammal at birth, but my orientation is fish. Don't misspecies me." The worrying aspect of this case is that police openly agreed he'd committed no crime, but his tweets, having been the subject of a complaint by a member of the public, were being recorded as a hate incident. The High Court overturned this and said, no, this is not. He wasn't targeting an individual, he wasn't being offensive, he wasn't inciting hatred. He was just using parody and satire to express a personal dislike of a movement. And that was upheld at his right to do that by the High Court. So, like the ID analogy, the problem with allowing that kind of restriction on what terminology is acceptable, either under the law or under social norms, is that such legislation or the ability to manipulate expression can then be turned from its original purpose to try and prevent offence and hurt being caused by people of a particular group, which is pretty decent. But if you restrict other more universally fundamental expressions, such as criticising a government or an official, and if we go back to imagining the far-right party we saw elected in the earlier example, if they had the legislative framework to enact laws that banned criticism of their policies, you've got a police state. And the results don't have to be left to your imaginations. Just read anything written by citizens of Germany between 1933 and 1945, and you'll see where they can lead. So, I don't know if you want to jump in with any thoughts at this stage.
Look, I know that we've had two movies now that have touched on free speech. One has said a denial that there are consequences of having free speech. You know, you can have negative consequences, and now we've got this one which says that free speech is paramount and it's a good thing. As far as did you see that recent British film, British miniseries Years and Years with Emma Thompson?
No, I didn't.
It's set in a slight over 10 years in the future, and it's all about governments, exactly what you're saying, Martin, just tweaking small little adjustments here and there, and before you know it, we've got ghettos and electronic monitoring of all these people, and it was pretty scary stuff. So I'm very sympathetic to what you've been saying, and I can really recommend to you and the listeners to see, I think it's a 4-part mini-series called Years and Years with Emma Thompson, because it pretty much crystallises exactly what you've been saying about how it doesn't take much to upend society when you get the wrong government, you get the wrong government taking advantage of existing legislation and existing technology.
Well, as Ohio did to sue Larry Flynt for conspiracy and therefore organised crime. And they used the RICO laws, which were designed to fight the mafia. We've seen it with Homeland Security, I believe, through Freedom of Information requests, that it's been revealed that 80% of prosecutions under the Homeland Security Act brought in the aftermath of 9/11 have actually been drug-related.
There you go.
Really loosely worded. And this also brings us to freedom isn't necessarily your freedom. I mean, most Western political leaders generally support the principle of a free market, some more than others, but the US, for nearly a century, the most influential industrialised country in the West, it's very true today as in the past. So you think, well, free market, free, sounds good, must be good. Well, it depends. If you have a truly free market, something that no countries have at the moment that I'm aware of, what happens is a very, very rich person will look at emerging or buoyant markets. They'll move into that market, undercut all the competitors, be they small family businesses, medium corporations or whoever. The undercuts are subsidised by the rich people's money, either their own, and you can look at John D. Rockefeller, and about 150 years ago, this is what he did, or they use their credit lines to borrow or use possibly shareholders' money. The smaller rivals can't compete, so at a suitable point during their demise, the rich people come in and buy them out, probably not very generously. Once a monopoly has been established, they'll charge Joe and Jane public whatever the heck they want. And this is not a theory, this is exactly how several American business institutions got started, Rockefeller being the most notorious, and his business practices led directly to the antitrust laws that still exist today. So maybe freedom is a word that means different things to different people, and it has to have safeguards and limitations. As far as free speech goes, maybe people have to be prepared to be offended, which, after all, was half of Larry Flynt's argument. The right to offend people appears to be enshrined in the US's First Amendment, although there are exceptions listed. You are not allowed to use the First Amendment protections for obscenity, fighting words, defamation, including libel and slander, child pornography, perjury, blackmail, incitement to imminent lawless action, truth threats and solicitations to commit crimes. Everything else is fair game. Larry's argument, which proved ultimately decisive, is that his publications did not come under the obscenity definition, and as he so eloquently put it, how can the depiction of sex, legal act, be classified as obscene when murder an illegal act is not? Go figure. Legendary film critic Roger Ebert said of this film and its subject matter, if Falwell had won his suit against Flynt, this newspaper, that he was writing in at the time, would be fundamentally different. The editorial cartoons could not make fun of public officials. The lawyers might have questioned a recent review in which I said a film should be cut up into ukulele picks. After all, that might have hurt the director's feelings, and Falwell himself might not have been able to broadcast his sermons in case they offended atheists, or you, or me. So maybe we should follow the advice of Lee Rowlands, who's the senior attorney at the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union for those of us outside the US. He said, and I quote, "We must all reach out and protect the speech that we most disagree with, or else the First Amendment is reduced to a popularity contest and has no meaning." So it's really tricky to walk the line between freedom of expression and offence, especially in the internet age where anything anyone says can be read, often within minutes, by a whole host of people, many of whom may not be amongst the original intended audience, and some of whom seem all too ready to take offence at pretty much anything. Some people managing to blur the difference between reading something they find genuinely offensive or insulting and something that expresses a view with which they disagree. So to close out this monologue, I'd like to offer this from Christina in her detailed email about this movie. So Christina said, when it comes to the idea of finding things obscene, I always think of a bit that George Carlin did around 30 years ago when talking about a Reverend Donald Wildman who complained to the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, which is in charge of radio and TV broadcasts. And I'm delighted to say that I hope the wonderful, late, great George Carlin won't object, but we've got a clip.
The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, decided all by itself that radio and television were the only two parts of American life not protected by the free speech provisions of the First Amendment to the Constitution. I'd like to repeat that because it sounds vaguely important. The FCC, an appointed body, not elected, answerable only to the president, decided on its own that radio and television were the only two parts of American life not protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. And why did they decide that? Because they got a letter from a minister in Mississippi. A Reverend Donald Wildman in Mississippi heard something on the radio that he didn't like. Well, Reverend, did anyone ever tell you there are two knobs on the radio? But hey, Reverend, there are two knobs on the radio. One of them turns the radio off, and the other one changes the station. Imagine that, Reverend. You can actually change the station. It's called freedom of choice, and it's one of the principles this country was founded upon. Look it up in the library, Reverend, if you have any of them left when you finish burning all the books.
And There we go. And George saying exactly what Larry's saying. You have a freedom of choice. If you don't like alcohol, don't drink a beer. If you don't like Hustler, don't buy it. If you don't like what's on the radio, turn it off or turn it over. I think we have to be a bit robust, and I'm aware in saying that, Andrew and I were talking before we went to air about, you know, we're kind of trying to avoid the, oh, this is political correctness gone mad, because that argument is also used by some pretty horrible people to justify their misogynist or racist views. It's so difficult to find a balance, but I think we have to accept that some things we read will find offensive. Well, fine, find them offensive, respond or criticise them, but don't try and get them shut down.
Okay, Marty. Thank you very much. Shall we close off things now?
Absolutely. If anyone does have any comeback, any thoughts, please do share them with us. You can write to us at hosts@historybyhollywood.com. On Facebook, it's facebook.com/historybyhollywood. On Twitter, we are at historybyhwood, HWOOD, because we didn't have enough, we weren't allowed enough characters to put the whole Hollywood in. And or via the website, where you can click on the contact form and just send us your thoughts. So next time out, not quite sure when that will be.
Not quite sure.
Will be The Coal Miner's Daughter, about Loretta Lynn.
And The Life of Loretta Lynn, starring Sissy Spacek, who won an Oscar for her portrayal. Okay, well, thanks for all those thoughts, Marty, and all your research on The People versus Larry Flynt. So until next time, it's see you later from me.
And see you later from me with a final. Christina, you're an absolute star, and thank you so much for all your help with that episode. Very much co-credited on that one.
Here.